as we talked about in the last lecture, science as it's currently practiced is only going to get us so far, right? It fails. It's failing even now to deliver deep truths. And so in order to kind of investigate what Kuyper's getting at a little bit more deeply, I want to introduce you to Aristotle's four causes, or I think a better translation is Aristotle's four explanations. Aristotle thinks that in order to fully, deeply understand something, you really have to be able to give the following four explanations of the thing you're investigating. So he says, look, there's a material cause or a material explanation of something. What is that? That's just the stuff the thing is made of. So you could think about this in terms of a house. What is a house made of? Bricks and wood and mortar and nails and glue and drywall, right? You get the idea. That's the material explanation, the material cause. Aristotle says we also need to fully grasp something, or at least grasp something more deeply. We need to be able to give the efficient cause, the efficient explanation. And that's just the thing that's the cause or the explanation that brings about the thing we're investigating, that brings it into existence. So in this case, think about the house. That might be the workers, right? The construction men and women who bring the house into existence. But that also would involve, maybe even more fundamentally, the architect. And so this actually leads us quite naturally to the third explanation or cause that Aristotle thinks we need in order to more deeply understand something: the formal cause. The formal cause is it's what tells us what a thing is. The formal explanation gives us the nature of the thing. What is that thing most fundamentally? That's the formal explanation. In the case of the house that we're talking about, well, it's that it's a house. And that tells us something important, because that tells us that A, this thing is supposed to function in a particular way. This tells us B, it was intended to be that way. This tells us something else. The formal cause gives us the kind of organizing principle that the matter has to obey, that the efficient cause has to respect in order to get something like that. So, just to illustrate this with the house example, suppose we have a pile of bricks and wood and nails and glue and mortar and drywall. Is that a house? No, that's not a house. Why? Because there's the right form hasn't been imposed upon the material. You don't get a house unless you've got the form imposed upon it in a particular way. That's the formal cause. And lastly, the fourth explanation or cause is the final cause. And this is what the thing is for, what it's directed towards. So in order to have a house, we've got to have something that is directed towards providing shelter, right? You can't just call sitting under a tree your house. That is not enough to make a house. That's the idea here. So all four of these explanations, according to Aristotle, are needed in order to provide more thorough, deeper explanations of things. Here's what's interesting about this. We're decent at detecting the matter, the material out of which a thing is made. And we might be okay in most cases or some cases at discovering the efficient cause, the antecedent circumstances that brought the thing we're investigating into existence. But we're terrible at investigating the formal cause and the final cause, the goal, the end at which the thing we're investigating is directed. In fact, in science as it's currently practiced, the formal and the final cause are completely ignored. The focus is really on the material and the efficient. Now let's see how this relates to what we're talking about, the relationship between science and sin. The difficulties that science has are the result of sin, and we shouldn't be surprised at this. We were told way back in Genesis 3 that our lives, every part of our lives, were going to be a lot harder because of sin. We just finished talking about the 7 vices. We spent a long time on those. So this should be crystal clear to us. Each of those vices can show up in every part of our lives, including our practice of science. Now, if all we had were our observations and experience, then even though our observations and experiences are affected by sin, they'd still reflect the external elements of the creation. So we get that nice cracked mirror analogy. A cracked mirror can still give a fairly accurate reflection. So sin is working against us. It's getting in the way. It's making our jobs harder to investigate, to engage in science. But it doesn't totally obscure everything. In every observation that we make, we've got 2 things happening, right? We've got the seeing, the actual seeing, and then we have our mind's engagement of what it is that is seen. So you can think about it like this. Perception involves a passive element and an active element. We are passively impressed upon by the natural, observable, visible world, and then we have to make sense of it. So, this is why Kuyper says, and I thought this was just brilliant, he says, look, the kid, the 12-year-old shepherd, can observe cattle grazing, and observing microbes in the lung under a telescope, under a microscope, are essentially the same sort of thing. And the way many people act is it's as though that's all science involves. Remember those 4 causes, those 4 explanations I just mentioned. The way we act many times as though science just is about telling us what stuff is made of and telling us what brought it about. And that's all science is supposed to do. But that's no different than the 12-year-old shepherd observing cattle grazing on a hill. That doesn't take any real skill or depth or insight. That's not getting us at the deep, deep truths of reality. And so Kuyper wants more for science, not less. Genuine science has to include making observations, composing a theory that accounts for the various causes and principles, and then make connections between the phenomena under investigation. That's genuine science. Making science simply observation is an attempt to free it from its relation to persons and their subjectivity. It doesn't go deep enough. It ignores all those 4 explanations. It just gives us the material and the efficient. It gives us nothing like the formal and the final causes. If science is done, just observation, right? That's all we care about. We just want to do observation. If science is merely done from a third-person perspective, that just mere observation perspective, then it can't account for the first-person perspective. It ignores it, and thus it cannot account for a massive amount of the natural world. Isn't that interesting? This is part of the reason Kuyper says science can be good, or the way I put it, science can be good at detecting some trees, but there are some trees it totally ignores, and thereby can never get us the forest. That is, science that is done from just the third-person perspective, just this observational perspective, data recording perspective, It leaves out persons altogether. Okay, so science is aiming at the truth, but that goal gets twisted. That goal gets perverted or distorted into the idea that only third person perspectives or observations are able to achieve the truth. Subjectivity, personality, personhood, those get discarded as irrelevant for science, right? We try to quarantine them, right? We try to shut them up. But the result is that any investigation of the person and their minds and whatnot is going to be deemed as either an investigation that doesn't get you to the truth, or our investigation of persons, our investigation of minds, our investigating of spiritual issues is going to get reduced to a study of the material. We'll treat persons as though they're mere material things. So either way, persons, spiritual matters, and of course God, get ignored. They get removed or reduced to non-persons, non-spiritual matters, non-God. This is super important. I teach a course on neuroscience. That is the study of neurons and their behaviors and how they produce various mental states. But almost the entire field attempts this study of the brain by attempting to reduce persons and their minds to material things and forces. So we treat persons as though they are not fundamentally different from mere collections of atoms. That's what a hyper-focus on the third person perspective implies. It eliminates subjectivity and treats it as though it's not real. But that's the opposite of the way the world really is. Since God exists, and God is personal, indeed God is three persons, then persons are more fundamental or more real than non-persons. Science, as it's currently practiced, is mostly done as though that wasn't true. As though persons are not more fundamental than non-persons. And what that gives us is this: scientism. Maybe some of you have heard that word, scientism. The idea that only certain types of investigation yield genuine knowledge, and that those types of investigation that yield genuine knowledge, those are the scientific ones, which are based on just empirical observation and experimentation. That's scientism. And so what ends up happening is the spiritual sciences get completely ignored. So we can use some standard scientific methods when we're investigating spiritual matters, but look, given the nature, given the difference between persons and non-persons, our normal scientific methods can't be the only tools we use. They can't be the best tools. Some other tools are going to be needed. For example, studying history and literature can reveal to us some of the internal operations of human persons. So because the creation, the universe, has at least two different sorts of things, the material and the non-material, the material and the spiritual, we have to engage those things differently. Mere observation is not, and it never has been, enough. It can't give us the origin, the coherence, and the destiny of things. Think back to those four explanations from Aristotle. If all we're doing is mere observation and recording, the recording of our observations, we're never going to be able to penetrate into the depths of the real origin of things, how they all fit together, and we're certainly not going to be able to explain what they're directed to. we're not going to be able to get the formal and the final cause that Aristotle talked about. Right? In order to get those things, what do we need to do? We got to reflect. We got to think. We got to do what persons do. Right? We're going to, in order to do that, in order to grasp the origin, the coherence, and the destiny, the goal of these things, right? We're going to have to go beyond mere observation. That's the idea. Right? You can think about it like this. Think about the notion of causation. Causation is hugely important for science. Have you ever observed causation? No. What you observe is one thing and then another. One thing and then another. One thing and then another. Causation isn't observed. In fact, the best place that we can think of, the most obvious place to locate causation in terms of our experience of it, is within ourselves. I cause things. I cause my mouth to speak. I cause my arm to rise. I'm more familiar with causation from my own internal subjective experience. And then I can use that to understand the world. Think about this with respect to that notion of final cause that we talked about earlier. This is sometimes called teleology, right? Having to do with the goal of things, the end to which things are directed. Mere observation isn't going to help us here, right? You can't observe the purpose or the function of something. Your mind has to be engaged. So if science is just about mere observation, then it can't tell us anything about the major questions that we have. And we have them all because we're human. And what's worse is that if we think that science is the only or the best way to discover truths, then we're going to wind up claiming that such questions are nonsense, or they're unanswerable, or they're answered only by materialistic assumptions. We're now at the point in science where everything is seen, everything is assumed to be material. Think about what that implies. No soul or mind, no God, no person. Remember our important principle. The visible represents the invisible. And if we take that principle seriously, we're going to see that our observations of the material world, that third-person investigation, is the beginning, not the end of the truly scientific endeavor. But sin has marred our ability to do this, to see things rightly. Thankfully, common grace gives us a bit of those abilities back.